Okay, so the team is here, right here. So Shazad Zatran, he is the program manager based in Kabul, Afghanistan. And he also have the two engineers for time basis was right now. And myself and David Hodgkin. So David, you want to say something? I need to mute this somehow, but I don't know how to do it. David?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, hi, everyone. Morning. Nice to meet everybody virtually.
Now he's a specialist of the, expert of the this shelter class and settlement components in a global scale. He's kind of famous, aren't you?
I've been doing global shelter response for about 20 years. I don't know if I'm famous as much as infamous, but yeah.
Maybe more infamous is the right terminology.
Yeah.
And of course, Mark, you want to say hi?
Hey everybody, back from Afghanistan. Unique experience for sure. Look forward to kind of telling everybody about it and talking through.
He looks very local, which is good. And Maddie, you want to say hi, Maddie?
Hi, everyone. Nice to see and hear from everyone again.
Yeah, she's been a great base support for all of us, from proposals to everything about it, to the project itself, reports. So thank you. And also that many other people involved on these programs, such as David Sonda and Julia, who actually did analyze the this whole wall system and so on, and people in DC and everywhere. So thank you so much. Still keep going, but we want to kind of give you a quick update of this program look like. So where is Afghanistan anyway? There it is right here. And the red mark, you can see schools, right? Then earthquake is right at the Pakistan border in this area. That's where the earthquake was. So you can see the map of this, particularly. So the border in Pakistan and India is down the south, actually, you can see there. And Iran is next door. So here's the epicenter, June 22nd, you can see that. It's estimated somewhere between magnitude 5.9 to actually magnitude 6.1, depends on which agencies you're actually looking at. And this is actually a seismic hazard map produced in about 5 years ago. So it shows this particular area, which is the dark brown, expected the spectral acceleration of a short period to be around the 1.5 G or so. So this is a 25-year return event. So it's pretty healthy. It's a typical 5-year design event, probably end up to about 1 G. So kind of equivalent to what you see in US West Coast type of a seismicity. And that area we are there is always a very stiff clay or the rock, bedrock, you see things like that. And this is a landslide risk map developed by USAID a few years back. As you can see, there are certain landslide risk exists, and we did saw some of the rock falls and so on. But right now, this landslide issue and the seismic hazard issue is a big deal. The reason is that this particular area, it's a high seismic area, as you can see, but earthquake is somewhat rare. Because this subduction zone caused kind of event, and last one is about 100 years ago. So population really do not have the memory of a recent earthquake like that. So that causes essentially general panic. And many people think that there will be volcanic eruptions in the area. Obviously, that's not the case, but there's some general panic, which we see everywhere in the whole world, by the way. You haven't seen the earthquake, that's what you see like that. So that's what's going on. So earthquake damage caused about 100,000 people to homeless. And I know, hey, this is maybe a little bit outdated information. So Mark or David, if something that new information comes out, you can always chime in. Okay. And affected about three different districts out there. And on the right side of the map is Pakistan, essentially. So structural assessment, our ground team, and led by Zadran, assessed the 457 compounds we call, which is essentially I showed you a little bit later. It's a unit. It's a pretty sizable area, usually about 10 to 20,000 square feet of a walled area, which has the multiple families and has many rooms inside of it. That's how the social structure built like that. So 457 compounds, probably we're looking at, what do you say, like David, about five to 10 rooms per compound?
I think we've now gone up the latest because the survey's been
6.
ongoing. Yeah, so I think it's actually even higher now. Yeah. We're looking at
so
Mark's got the latest numbers on that.
Yeah, it was like 5.7 families in there. Comes to about a little over 30 people per compound now is what we're seeing.
I see.
Kind of crept up as we've gotten into other geographic areas.
Yeah.
And rooms
So-
wise, yeah, three to six just depends drastically.
Yeah. And we basically looked at the quite spread area, right? I haven't seen the latest map of the whole assessment, but just basically to spread out all the Spiran, Barnell, and Gayan districts throughout the whole affected area. And so that reason we did this, there is a joint assessment done by the UN agency, by house assessment of whole affected area. But one thing we noticed that is the technical components is pretty lacking because they didn't have the engineers to assess actually damage. They actually questioned that the owner of each compound to ask. So it was a little bit different situations there. So we actually using this technique to supplement the technical data. I think someone need to be muted. How's that? Okay. All right. So team developed this assessment tool. This is based on ArcGIS and uses APCO survey 1, 2, 3. Mark, you want to talk about a little bit?
Yeah. So just, I think most people are pretty familiar with the ArcGIS platform. Over the kind of years, there's been a lot of platforms to collect data in the field. Most recently in Haiti, we used Kobo Toolbox, which is very popular in the humanitarian realm. Being a good private sector company, we look to improve on that. And Survey 123 is just a lot more stable, a lot more reliable, I think. I mean, we didn't have any issues with data loss. So essentially it's phone-based or tablet-based, whatever, mobile device-based. Go out and collect, really good GPS coordinates, and then you can fill out kind of a survey format. We collected essentially building data, people data, occupancy data, and then building typology, simple stuff like that, and then kind of estimated habitable areas, looking at damaged areas that can be repaired rapidly, then damaged areas that would take a little bit longer to repair, and then sort of like totally collapsed and failed areas. And then all that data gets aggregated into the database, and Savajit, our GIS expert guru in India, I mean, he's been incredible help on this. He developed all these surveys, like real time. We were kind of in the field going, oh shoot, we gotta add this. He'd just go ahead and edit it up real quick. Really a phenomenal resource and ability. It adds just an incredible capacity, compared to even what we had just a couple years back. So that was really incredible.
Exactly. So yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. So the surveys kind of identified there's really three types of buildings that we saw. The first one is this Paksha. It's essentially what they do is they take the local mud at the site, they sort of hydrate the mud, and then it gets built up into these lifts or layers. They're about 50 centimeters thick and about 50 centimeters wide. And then some skilled laborers or some skilled kind of artisans or masons come in. And they're the ones that actually kind of erect the walls and trim them off smooth, so like you see here in the graphic. Then there's, of course, some stone and rock construction. You see that in the middle over there. That was the least common, at least of what we saw in the areas where we visited. And then there's this mud brick, which was fairly common as well, but more so used, I'd say they build kind of the perimeter walls of the compound in that Paksha system, and then as they added on rooms inside, they might be done in mud brick and kind of various other things. So that's kind of building typologies.
Yeah, so this is one of the compound so-called building you see from outside. I mean, as you can see, pretty gigantic, so-called structural archetype. It's made of mud. I mean, can you imagine? Just those are great walls. Essentially looking at usually about the 5 meters, so which means about 15 feet high, plus minus, that type of a wall. And the thickness is 50 centimeters. That's kind of typical thing. 10-to-1 ratio, 50 centimeters, about what, 2 feet, somewhere there, little shy of it. So, but it's all made of mud. But one thing we notice, if it's done right, this is actually a great structural system. And it's kept it dry. You can see the kind of a little roof sticking up there to provide it that faster drainage. And also they have a coating over the mud wall to drain the things fast, which I show you a bit later. But whole system essentially act as a rocking wall. So rocks and back and forth and back and forth. So our Italian team analyzed the structure looking at about 0.15 G acceleration, which is which means probably it's fairly small intensity. Start seeing the essentially activation of the rocking motion. So till that it's acting as almost like a fixed base. Then once reached the 0.33 G, which is started causing certain collapse in certain mechanism. And up to 50 G, you're going to see the 50% probability of collapse. Now, what does a 50% G means? This is a pretty much design level event. That's what you see, like, about you're looking at kind of California kind of earthquake. You're going to see that. Now, this analysis we done really quickly, and it does have a very conservative assumptions in there. And because out there, when we see the actual performance of the structural system, I mean, you see it very rare to actually collapse over the wall system like that, So we're actually looking at finite element nonlinear rocking analysis to actually see what is it the true behavior of this like this. But it's very encouraging to see even a quick analysis showing the fairly decent certain capacity to take this kind of loading. So this is the bottom of a wall. You can see little cracks. That's the initiation of the kind of overturning, kind of rocking start happening in there. And this is what we call rooms inside of a compound. So what people do is a compound wall and built, actually after the fact, or keep evolving, they built the rooms for the family members along the way. And that's what's going on here. And you can see the roof structure. Let me see here. Roof structure is it's mud. It's a mud clay. So what they do is every year there's some certain sites, right? So they keep adding it. So this particular building you see here is only about 12-inch thick or so for the thickness of the roof. But some cases we saw 3 times, 4 times thicker than that. So it become extremely heavy, really dangerous condition. And you can see the wood sticking out, that's a joist. And those rooms inside is a very small room. Usually, I think mark about 20 by 20 feet, maybe somewhere in the range. About
Yeah,
100
I mean, like width-wise, basically the backside of these rooms is that perimeter wall that you saw from the outside. They're probably, I don't know, I'd say they range 12 to 15 feet wide and a little longer, yeah, 15 to 20 feet long. It really just depends.
Yeah. David, you want to talk about compounds a little bit?
Yeah, I think they were really fascinating. There's this sort of social structure that exists where actually interesting too, as I've been reading up more about it, there's a word in the local language that sort of describes it as a fort, and that a family lives within. So you've got a senior male member of the family, and then his sons and their partners will move into the compound. And so from what we could gather, the way that the rooms were divided up sort of varied across families, so that one family might have 2 rooms or 3 rooms or 1 room, or there might be young girls living in 1 room or boys in another, but it varies. And then the center of the compound is basically empty. It's an open space. And that means, we could see that this was a very unusual sociological form, but also it was a bit challenging for the global humanitarian sector to deal with, because all of their systems are set up to think of a house and a household. And this was really more like a compound and rooms, and then families within that, heads of families within that. So sort of a bit of an unusual social structure to measure against, measure most of the normal systems and tools against.
Hey, David, so I know that green is that's where you like a little farm, a little agriculture going on. What is a round thing? I never thought about.
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, in the middle of those spaces, the things we sort of saw was that sometimes there was a cooking space, like a shade structure, or there was a well. There was sometimes there was an area that people were storing cattle. But basically, the general sense was that when you walked out of one of those rooms, you could see across the compound. And I guess that there's so many issues around women in this space. Once those compound walls are up and they exist, then women are pretty free to wander around inside that space. But basically, they're not allowed out. You don't see women publicly in this area at all. The women are completely hidden away. Even when we were there, women would hide in the rooms that we never saw. You know, I'm unconvinced that there actually are women in Afghanistan at this point. You know, it was very rare to see them. We didn't see women in space at all. But I think that part of the safety there might be part of the social thing is that I think when you walk out of that room and you're a woman, you can see everywhere in the compound and everybody can see you. It's a very safe space.
Yeah, so it's compounds, it's kind of like that. But then with that heroic figure on the right is the Jago. He's one of IOM, the UN agency colleague. They've been actually we work with IOM as very closely or more than closely. We're essentially embedded into the IOM, and which is a UN agency, and a part of we basically work as a part of a UN agency. That's what we did like that. So you can see that little green patch, what David's talking about. It's a very important, kind of build everything's there because that's used as the actual living space. So it's critical to actually the, reconstruction strategy need to follow the social structure there. David?
I think it's worth commenting on this one. Where Jago's standing, that temporary fence that a family's put up, that's the compound wall. We came across a compound where just the back wall had fallen over. So this is sort of a privileged look into a compound. It's quite a large compound, a recently built compound. So it's sort of clean and neat and not full of as many rooms as it might end up with. And you can see, I think there you can see the family starting to rescue all their building materials there in the middle. And you can see these sort of people are living in the tents in the middle and cleared space there on the classic sort of kitchen garden area. But also I think in the back, over the back there, you can see what we commonly saw where roofs have caved in, but walls are still standing. And that area was in the back there is sort of quite repairable.
So here's like a typical construction of a room. That wall you're looking at, this wall right here, which is the compound wall itself. And there is the actual, about 10 feet out of it, there's also thick wall, which is carrying the little room structure. You can see that the wood joist space that dimensions there. And you can see how the wood joist kind of rests into the wall itself. It's actually very important. And we saw this quite often. So here's a compound wall. What happens here is that the compound wall, obviously rocking back and forth, it moves, but the smaller walls stay there, or different frequencies move in it. So what happened here is that while it's moving back and forth, the joist, the roof joist, the wood joist stay there. Long as there's a good bearing, it's going to keep back and forth and back and forth. And shorter piece, remember that on the front of the room, which the many cases wood is penetrated through. So whole thing's kind of moving back and forth and back and forth. So you can see that quite a bit of this type of the so-called damage or the evidence of a movement of the independent movement of the wall itself to this room structure. Now, I like that this type of failures. This is actually really acting as almost like a friction devices in a sense. So it definitely has some energy dissipation behavior going through this kind of failures and this kind of phenomenon. So here's the kind of interesting picture. You can see that this big piece of wood rested about what looked like about 1 centimeter, 2 centimeter, about 1 inch or so. So this earthquake a little bigger, this whole thing probably did collapse. So one of the things we noticed that survived ones has a really long bearing into the wall itself. If it's penetrated through, those are good practice because it can keep moving back and forth, right? But if it's sitting so shallow, any movement will cause a collapse. And especially that if the people are annual base adding the clay mud as an insulation to the roof, so thick, so heavy, and get a huge beam like this, that's how most people die. Then we lost about 1,000 people or so, or maybe more. And that caused by the bearing to fail. That's how that actually injury and death happened. This is the compound wall. You can see this kind of they put the so-called clay finish over it. The clay finish is the made of the obviously local clay from just right on spot usually, and you can see a little aggregates. That's the also it's mixed in a clay already, very stiff clay, by the way. But they actually mix with this hay. So what happened is that when the rain comes, that the hay makes the drainage much faster because clay plus water is going to melt clay, so it's very important to have the water to be kind of repelled from the surfaces. But if it's done right, you can see this beautiful finish like that. Here's the evidence of failure I was talking about. You can see that the wood falling this corner right here, and this used to be, this wood was in there, so it doesn't have enough bearing length. It's going to fall off, kill people. Pretty simple process. But you can see the actual person wall itself has very little lead damage there. Here's that's how failure modes look like. Heavy roof, no bearing, any movement, kill people. And this is the actual clay brick. Mark, you want to talk about a little bit?
Yeah, so again, clay brick, the roof systems are the same. It's made from the same stuff, the clay on site, take it, they make it into their standard blocks. So a few things that we identified between kind of successful construction with clay brick and unsuccessful construction was this water protection aspect was number one. So, water shows up, runs down, and it washes all the mortar out from between the bricks, and that was really, really detrimental. You can see an example here. Then the bricks are free to slide around. So there's an example where it's done well. There was different mixtures as well of kind of mixing in kind of smaller angular aggregates with it. There was cases where there was no aggregates and they performed really poorly. Here you can see there's kind of some good stuff there. David also talked, feel free to jump in here, Dave, but also how that helps with the water. As it runs down, it helps create sort of irregular lines of water running down so you don't get so much kind of erosion away of it. I mean, after all, it is all just mud. So, and all this stuff is made on site. Like there's no manufactured, in Haiti, it was all about getting like quality block manufactured. So the challenge here is pretty different in that we need to be able to teach the actual constructors that are going to be on site to be able to do this stuff. That's sort of a difference in reconstruction versus Haiti about sourcing quality block.
Yeah, we'll address a little bit later, but it's so true. I mean, first the people talking about repairing the roads, right? Okay, I thought it's a fairly decent idea. Once you get there, you're gonna see there's no roads to repair. Roads are essentially like a dry creek bed, mountains, that's the roads. So there's nothing to repair there. And so once the winter comes, which happens after November, places essentially get shut down. There's no access at all unless you helicopter in. So it's a very harsh condition. And so bringing in the steel or rebar or cement, well, it can be done, I guess, but becoming really expensive, takes a long time. And most of all, that kind of things cannot really help the people in the long run, right? Because there's no way they can build this house with the concrete out there because there's not available. There's no way to get to. So the challenge here is how we can actually reconstruct using the locally available materials. That's why we're so into this, what happened here. So here's the test. Mark, repairable or unrepairable?
Repairable. So
Good.
I passed.
Passed.
So, when you look at it, there's certainly a lot of debris and stuff you're seeing in the front, but realistically, you're talking about some kind of relatively minor repairs to the front wall. And then that end cap wall you can see on the right-hand side kind of popped off the edge there. But these types of repairs, in talking to the community and people there, they're able to build one of these compounds and rooms, everything in like 3 months, nothing to finish. So these types of repairs are literally a few weeks. And this was kind of as we took our initial walkthroughs and assessments, it was kind of figuring out what was rapid to repair because time constraint of winter coming up is critical. And so many of them fell into this category. Here we can see a good example of those really thick roofs. I mean, this is probably, 45 centimeter, 18, 20 inch thick at least. Really, really heavy roof, but front of the building's it's fine. This is the back corner, actually, that same one we were just looking at. And then end wall again. Here's
repairable or unrepairable.
Hey, Dave, what do you think?
Oh, repairable. And I think the real question here was what the people need to understand is that when we came in, the question here was what's the best emergency shelter solution for people to ensure for winter. So everybody's been given a tent. It's going to get down to -10, -15 up in these areas. And one of the questions that we were sort of posed was, or looking at, was whether repairability was an adequate emergency shelter solution. And we sort of got to remember that unlike most disasters in the world, that this country doesn't have a government. It's got the Taliban terrorists in control. So you have a de facto administration. And that means that the World Bank, IMF, ADB, nobody's really going to chip in and fund a major reconstruction program. So it's not like anybody's going to come charging in and build lots and lots of houses. So it's more we were trying to look at what's spaces that could be repaired rapidly and be used as adequate shelter for winter, adequate emergency or transitional shelter for winter. And so this is a good example where I would say a lot of those rooms were repairable for that purpose.
Repairable, of course, isn't cut one and build back. And this is one of the rare cases that we saw the actual failure of a wall like this one. And we actually interviewed the owner, you know, what do you think has happened to it? He goes, of course, it's gonna fail. Because he said that particular area, he built a wall a little tilted or something like that. So yes, if it's don't do right, it definitely fails. One more thing, major difference between the failures and not failed one, it's a lot to do with the quality of it. Quality of the how actually the clay is mixed and the size of aggregate and how it's built. It's actually really critical one. And also that as Mark is talking about the water drainage and the finish over that. So that type of things are critical elements of it. But if it's done right, it actually works great. Now, so question we're thinking about it, why those buildings evolved here? You know, you just think this way. I mean, people live in it for thousands of years, right? And there's nothing to build on but just a clay. And also the you know, earthquake does happen fairly frequently. Every 100 years, every 150 years happens, every 50 years. And you can see this kind of archetypes essentially evolves. It evolves. You know, thing doesn't work, they don't build again. So that's why I think there's a best practices exist in this kind of community where the highly seismic resistant, you know, elements like that or idea or methodologies kind of exist. Also, we do notice that many people do not follow the so-called wisdom of how to do right. And we're talking to one of a compound owner whose compound is completely fine. It has no very limited damage if it's nothing. And he was saying when he was built in the compound, many neighbors laugh at him. They're laughing at, why make your wall so thick? Why are you putting finish over this thing? Why this, why this? You're silly. But guess what? His compound survived. So there's definitely the knowledge and wisdom exists in the community. And what our next chapter is really that extract that and have a certain scientific background of this thing that use as a so-called documentation for repair and reconstruction. That's what we're looking at. So this is one of a clay thing. It's repairable or not? Probably not, because what happened here is that once that clay gets exposed like that with the rain, it melts. You can really squish it with the foot, you know. So, but those clay can be reused, by the way, if it's a good clay with a good aggregate in it. So here's the results. It's pretty fascinating. So-called collapse one is what we call maybe red, tagged in the per ATC 20 kind of a look of it, about 17%. And repairable, yellow and a combination small red is about 50%. And the habitable, which means green has no damage or nothing at all, is about 30%. So repairable, someone was probably considered to be a red. So if you take that, probably the actual red is probably up to like a 30%. Yellow is a 30%, habitable green is a 30%. So 30 mix. This is like a magic number. This is something we see this everywhere. It's pretty fascinating, isn't it, Mark? I mean, this combination that we just saw at the 2021 Haiti event was something like this, you know. I mean, slightly different here and there, but it's this patterns you can see quite a bit. So we figured that the repairing room takes less than 1 month. In many cases, less than a few weeks, actually, a couple of weeks. And even the reconstruction take less than a couple of months. And so if it's done right, if it's immediately actions there, should you have at least a 50% of the people who lost their homes or shelters can shelter through by the repair and the construction by the winter. But it just depends on how fast the funding and how fast that the UN agencies can move. Because as you can see, there's no like traditional NGOs or companies you see out there because Afghanistan right now is, as you know, a very peculiar position. And so there's only UN agencies going to really, taking the main chunk of this work. You want to add something, Mark or David, to this, the results?
No, I think that's fairly accurate. I think that the other thing sort of to have in mind is that the area that we're going into, it's been this sort of Taliban controlled heartland up on the borders there for a long time, and so really nobody's had much access. So unlike other parts of Afghanistan where you've got sort of roads and power and infrastructure, then there's much more intrusion of modernity and much more sort of adoption of modern building materials. But what we saw out here, that it just really was almost pure in its form. There was very rare that we saw any steel or concrete. We saw occasional painted doors and windows, and of course people had cars, and we saw, there's no power lines, so people had solar panels for power. But aside from that, really, it was like an ancient construction system.
Yeah, it's almost like untouched by the outside, so influence almost, right? Because it's really hard to get to number one. There's no roads to get up there. Number one, right? Number two, it's been a war zone for the last 40 years. So there's no like normal people like us show up ever down there to just recent to probably now. And so it's in a sense that culturally very unspoiled or untouched in a sense. So it's very fascinating place, I must say. Social structure is obviously something we just can't imagine. It's completely different, and how the compound structures, that's a match. The architectural forms match the social structure, so that type of thing. So it's definitely it's engineering work here to reconstruct and repair. Also need to understand the kind of social format and also evolution of architecture. Really need to understand that to do right solutions, which can be implementable fast, and also that be able to impact the safety of the residences and population down the road. That's actually really critical. So as David and Mark said, that most compounds does have enough rooms to be repaired as shelter. That's a key there. For example, back there, that wall, I know that's a really good wall. And it does have a lot of the party walls. It's like a honeycomb. It's a pretty stable structure. Just have to have the right wood, joist roof structure, have a right bearing, and should not build any more thick clay roofing like that. Deb, you can talk about this outreach. This is actually a critical one, because people never experienced this kind of earthquake or disaster. And they're really scared, especially the geotechnical hazard. That's something they're really concerned about. And also just scared to just want to even move out from that area, which is considered extremely difficult and expensive.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting there because like in most disasters, most of the recovery will actually be self-recovery. In any disaster, humanitarian input is quite small. If we look at it globally, we normally manage to help do about 5% of the work. Is sort of where the humanitarian sector's at. So there's a couple of things there. One is about empowering that self-recovery process and making sure that whoever's building whatever has sort of the knowledge about what they should be doing and understands what they should be doing. But also empowering in terms of encouraging it to start happening, because often people will sit around waiting, expecting and looking for assistance. And I think that also it's really important to understand that the assistance that will be coming in this area just will be limited. There won't be very much. It's like most other disasters. We're in there, we do the emergency shelter, then there's this sort of temporary transitional shelter phase, and then there's long-term recovery operations. Big money turns up, and that's not going to happen from all accounts.
Yeah, and I think Saleh, he's been assisting us from Philadelphia. He actually recently moved to the U.S. from Afghanistan, and he was on the make introduction to Mr. Zadran on the field. I think Saleh is in the call. Are you here? If you're here, you might need to mute it first. Unmute it.
Hi,
Yeah, so-
everyone. Yes, I'm
Oh
here.
yeah, hi Saleh.
Good morning, afternoon, good evening. Yeah.
How are you?
Fine, thank you. How are you? Nice to
So I
see you
must,
all.
I must say you have a beautiful, beautiful country out there. Just no question about it. I mean, like a national park grade, the place where you're there. You know, just
Yeah,
huge
thank you.
mountains. You know, it's beautiful, high mountains. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
You know, so Saleh, I think it's a really key thing that it's all coming out to communications, right? It's not like we have all the money in the world to fix things out there, but it's all coming down to, okay, what would be the best way to repair, best way to construct those clay mud houses, and how people see the risk, live with the risk, you know, live with the natural hazard risk, right? We do that in Japan and California and many different parts of the world. So, but that's something that people are used to living, you know, where the ground is actually not stable. You know what I mean? Because the last time was earthquakes 100 years ago. So we see this communications are really components, a very important part of it. How do you see it, Saleh? How do you see the best way to actually communicate to the population?
So one thing, I think not only in Paktika or in all in the rural part of Afghanistan, the houses are planned and built as per the traditional requirements and traditional the material availability. So when they are doing that, the first thing the people don't do it like the hazard mapping in those areas. You see in those areas when a small disaster comes, the most vulnerability goes to the populations in terms of flood, earthquake, everything. But the good thing that the local material is quite cheap, and also the local architect that traditionally you mentioned about Paksa, the mud-made, you know, that is the house building. That is not only in terms of the using the local materials to be very cheap and quite accessible. That's in terms of the climate also, because I am also from a very cold province in Afghanistan, from Logar province. So you know that if a mud-made house is built during winter, that is very warm. So you don't need to, you know, that invest a lot, or you just use much on the heating of the houses. But you know, that's people can keep it during the summer, because that's a completely mountainous area. So that's in terms of the it is very hot in summer sometime, you know, that's a bit cold for the people. This is one thing. And the second thing, accessibility. You saw the mountains, there are no communication, anything, accessibility to bring, you know, that's the other bricks and other to those areas. The best way is, I think at the beginning, we talked also to, you know, that is in terms of technical, you know, that is consultation. Miyamoto can play a very important role in that to consult with people. But in terms of the materials, I think considering the short term of the winter is coming after 3-4 months. So the winter will come 4-5 months. So the best way is that to use the same local materials, stone, rocks, and also the mud and the bricks they are making traditionally in those areas. And the local, you know, that is the expertise, skilled laborers also, because if you bring people from outside, they don't know how to do it and what to do it. So that is, I think the best way is to right now for that to be more safe and also more faster and more accessible. The local materials, local skills, but with some good technicals and you know, that's some good points that came out from this current assessment. Thank you.
Well, I'm so glad, Saleh. I mean, Saleh, we didn't talk about this message particularly, but what you just said exactly, that the sentence by sentence that we've been talking out there, you know.
Only.
So I'm glad we're on the same page. You just verified us. That's good.
I think one of our interesting challenges, Saleh, and you could probably relate to it, is that engineers I mean, Afghan has no shortage of engineers, like most countries that we go to, and no shortage of people who understand the context and all the rest of it. But a lot of the engineers that were being employed by the UN agencies, they're people who studied in Kabul and they studied in steel and concrete. And, you know, the solution to the world is steel and concrete. And, you know, that's the only way you're going to, and it's sort of like a national development agenda, which it makes lots of sense. But you know, when you don't even have a road and you don't have electricity and you don't, and it's, you know, there's sort of still in a Taliban heartland, very complex area to operate in, to get into. It's just not a reality. It's not, so we face this problem of agencies, pushback from agencies where their national engineering staff, on this, national trained agenda to build sort of Kabul high-rise buildings and steel and concrete buildings, and getting people to understand that that traditional vernacular architecture and that mud construction is completely valid and good, and climatically appropriate, culturally appropriate, and repairable quickly, etc. This is one of our. It's not just communicating to the effective community, but it's also communicating to the aid or assistance community is a challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. The good thing there, because I work in those areas, I was working in 34 provinces with the engineers. You have a good human resource in those areas. The engineers, they implemented the projects, and the government, the World Bank, and the other project during the 20 years, they know very well the context. I mean, the traditional context, values, and also in terms of, that is the context of the, that how they can mitigate, overcome on unexpected challenges. So in terms of that, in Paktia, you can find a lot of engineers, they work for 10 years, 5 years, 20 years, 25 years in those areas, in Paktika, host everywhere. I think the only thing worries me, that is the shortage of time, because in those areas, very harsh winter, and before the snow, the cold winter starts, like, that. So for that, that I'm a bit worried about that. Otherwise, I think the plan would be, that proceed very well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that we are very close to get the contracts for next phase, so that would be really the jump start of, just try to repair many rooms as much as possible before the winter happens. So, that could be used as a so-called emergency shelter, become durable shelter, type of approach essentially. But I mean, our team got there a little bit late because of all the visa and political issues. We didn't get there till almost a month after the earthquake. And so when we got there, so-called UN shelter cluster system, what it is, UN has many different agencies, right? Like UN OCHA, UN this, everything. So what UN cluster system is that all the agencies there to have a common technical kind of approach or coordination. That's what the whole thing cluster system is like that. Also, there's one for shelters like essential housing like this, and there's education and wash and throughout health. So we are embedded into the shelter cluster system, and that's actually really important critical elements here. And when we got there, man, let me tell you, everyone used reinforced concrete and steel. It was just we just kind of said, "Oh my God, it's going to be really, not going to be work out so well." And I must say, our team, David and Mark and Zatran, and I am colleagues, is really the change in the mindset of how the UN shelter cluster system. They really know. I can see it sincerely. They believe that what we're talking. So it's definitely that even project over today, which is not going to be the case, but I think that we done our team, those guys done such a great job there. I must say, All right, so let's see here. So we combine privacy screening essentially to just make sure privacy in a compound. Obviously, it's not very expensive. Somewhere between $100-200. And wall repairs, as we talked about, keep the social structure. It's critical. Somewhere between maybe $500 to $1,000 to repair the compound walls. It's not very expensive. Repair the houses, the vernacular room per se inside a compound. $500 to $1,000 maximum. I think at the real sense, probably less than that. I just got a feeling of it. It's essentially materials are free per se, right? You get from the ground, really. You may go to the 1 kilometer away potentially. It's not that far. You have to get from that. And I think just the labor components of it, so that's that numbers come from. But it's very, very affordable to done this much quicker. And even a new reconstruction estimation is around $3,000 per house. That's what we're looking at. And the seismic upgrade is the do not disturb what is good, right? I think that's a really important one, especially that they have a very fragile kind of a structural system, as you can see. It's rely on rocking. Rocking system is great. It does absorb vibrant energy. As you know, that many of the mid-rise buildings in the Bay Area or high-rise buildings in Japan, they use the rocking system as to absorb energy. So we know that it's a very stable system if it's done right. But some of the things can be done would be that adding the more good bearing connections. I think it's a very important one. And I think that's probably one of the most important things, make sure that those roof structure doesn't fall off when things move around too much. So that's what death is come from. So that's the critical parts that right there. So next step for us is that the geohazard. So we have two main things we are about to sign a contract probably next week. Is the geohazard investigation, which is the understanding of it's more like communication about what is the risk to live here, how can you live, and there will be no volcano eruptions. That's something we can guarantee. So that type of things. So that'll be done by our teams in California to India to New Zealand and Nepal, and those are teams involved to get the and also obviously the Afghanistan experts. It's very important to involve the experts local level because this brain power does exist, and I think to use as much as possible locally is a really critical one. And we're going to develop the tools and the training of the so-called repair and reconstruction elements, and provide a technical support in the field hubs. We're looking for 3 different hubs in the affected area, provide technical centers where our Afghanistan engineers will be working with the counterparts of UN agencies to basically provide the training, port control, and such. So those are basically 2 main programs we actually just need to be done again for next 3 months or so. You want to add something, David, Mark?
I'd add that I think that it's been really interesting that it's been complex to come in with the UN. Afghanistan is a complex country to go into. We can't just get on a plane and fly in there and land in these remote areas. It's security issues and visa issues, so it's been complex for us to get in this time. But I think it's been a really important exercise for Miyamoto, where we've actually really heavily engaged with the IASC cluster coordination mechanism and been seen as a technical tool and positioning ourselves as a technical tool for the clusters. And I think coming in with quite a strong relationship with IOM and the potential to sort out those sort of technical details of how to get in the future, so that we could get with a long-term agreement and be able to get in there faster, quicker, and do this again. So I think there's been a lot of us figuring out our relationship and how we can tie into the cluster system and act as a technical support to that, and us figuring out our relationship with IOM and how that's going to work, as well as actually us doing the work on the ground. But I do agree also with what Kit said earlier, that we've really brought about a bit of a zeitgeist out there, because when we landed, it was a bunch of engineers in Kabul who'd decided that 90% of houses were totally destroyed and irreparable. And the only solution was to go in and build 2-bedroom steel and concrete houses. And that was just, it's just ridiculous. It would never happen within the time frame, within the budget. It was just a silly idea. And we were able to sort of come along and say, look, actually, there's lots and lots of stuff that's repairable. And the amount of shelter that the average family needs for emergency shelter is about half of what they had prior to the disaster. That'll be enough to get them through this winter. And if 51% of the shelters are repairable, then we can achieve most people's transitional temporary shelter needs can be covered through repairs. And that this will be cheaper, faster, more culturally appropriate, blah, 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 blah. And we managed to get that zeitgeist across. And I think that's really, really critical, is achieving that goal. If we don't achieve anything else, that's been a huge change. These 2 things, these 2 outcomes, work out how we might do this better next time, and pre-positioning ourselves and achieving that absolute change in thinking across the board. From then on, getting these additional contracts to actually keep helping this happen, I think is just to me, it's like a bonus.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting part of it is that when we saw the joint assessment call for 90% is completely destroyed and need to be new construction. And it was funny, we were not even there yet. Our team talked about this can't be right. It doesn't right, So our whole thing was, okay, we're going to send technical teams. So we're going to build technical teams to actually reassess this thing. But we can assess all of them, by the way. So we assess the sampling technique to see that what does the total scope look like. That's why you saw the results of that. So that's how we analyze the thing. So let's see, we got 5 minutes. So Any questions
I
or
I just wanted to
comments?
add a couple, I just wanted to add a couple things. One thing I thought was really interesting is that as we went through these damaged buildings and stuff, and we see this a lot, when you know, as we went into Haiti, people are asking for technical information. You know, they're not necessarily asking you build me a new house. They're asking for like engineering technical information. That's one. And then two is that, you know, keeping in mind that it's a reminder, engineers, you know, are the base of engineering is converting materials that you have into things that you need. And it's not just, you know, reinforced concrete and structural steel like in the Bay Area. You know, the roots of engineering date back to using natural materials like this. So sorry, just wanted to jump in and add that.
Yeah,
Alex?
some more question people said here. Okay, Shakza said, would geohazard investigation improve the hazard maps? I don't think it's gonna improve the earthquake hazard maps because it's not like we're doing the geophysical study here, but they will improve the kind of understanding of the geohazard in a point of like a rock falling area or potential that the landslides. We plan to do 80 different locations in the affected area to kind of randomly pick, to investigate the soil stability of it, you know. So we're gonna have probably a little better understanding of the so-called geohazard in a sense. And yeah, that's right. It's more like a communication components of that. And how to fix the cracked clay walls? Well, if it's a cracked really bad, just like you saw one picture, corner cracked, we can just remove the part, take it off, put a new one in. It takes only probably 3 weeks or so to do that particular piece of cracks you saw. Any other questions or comments? I guess Zadran is not here, huh? I don't think. If you see, I want to give an introduction, but maybe not.
Is there any kind of technical solution for that? You know, using the local material?
Yeah, Charles, it's essentially what thanks. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, we're gonna essentially extract what is a best practice, why it's working. And that particular information is not well known for everyone out there. So we're gonna use that information to essentially communicate that what is that the practice should be like. And so for that matter, we actually as a consultant, we have two so-called what is this? Just clay mud experts from
Mud earth
France.
construction.
Yeah, mud
Yeah.
earth construction experts from France. They're going to
Yeah.
be there.
Is there
hopefully next week.
anybody was studying the maybe fiber reinforcing, you know, plastic fiber reinforcing in mud, you know, in clay?
Yeah. Sure. I think that's going to make a huge difference if you put fibers or stuff like that. That become much more cohesive. The only problem of that approach is they were not going to be able to get them.
The fiber, the plastic?
No.
They cannot get the plastic, the roll of plastic stuff?
Well, roll plastic. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, I think the other thing, Charles, is that, and what we've sort of seen is that actually when it's built well, this has performed fine. We don't need to upgrade it particularly. What we need to do is stop some bad practice. So we can see that where people are building badly. So for example, where the aggregate, those clay walls are built with aggregate, small aggregate, like a concrete wall construction. But when the aggregate is too large and it's round, as an example, obviously the concrete fails, or the pashka fails, or where we're seeing the bottom of the wall having poor drainage and getting soaked, then it fails. So it's not about us coming in and trying to do any great new technical solution. I don't think it's needed. And if we did, we don't, you know, you need a lot of research to figure out the dynamics of these particular walls and whether you're going to have a net positive effect or a negative effect, and also what the environmental impact is going to be of what you do, and whether communities are going to keep doing it. Whereas if we just stick to the existing structural systems that they're using and promote best practice and demote worst practice, then actually the system of construction is adequate and fine. So a good example would be, Mark pointed out before, that we had one roof there that was 12 inches thick and another roof that was 40 inches thick. And so obviously building a 40-inch thick roof out of earth puts an incredible load on the building. And so you'd be recommending that as poor practice. And the 12-inch thick roof, and often people are adding more earth for winter, but then they need to sort of scrape it off and restructure and stuff like that as you go. So it's more, again, not trying to, yeah, there's lots of other ways that we can improve it, but is that the right thing to do? And in this case, it's probably not.
And also, we want to impact not only this reconstruction phase. I'm talking about 10 years from now, when we visit back, that hopefully people are using the best practice. So which means it has to be locally available. Fiber reinforced plastic will not be available locally, and they can afford it. As Carlos said here, it's very expensive in Lebanon. Sabine, you have some questions. I know you're mute, so you're not mute.
Yes, so I really like the approach taken here. So there's like three different approaches to recovery. One is institutional, which means like humanitarian partners or government or sort of public assistance supports rebuilding or recovery. And the second is when it's called kin or mutual assistance, where sort of family or friends help each other, or remittance money from elsewhere comes in, or there's sort of peer-to-peer learning and exchange and fundraising. And the last one is self-recovery. And sort of in the 1970s, there was the first sort of in the English literature, the first comparative analysis across like, I think more than 100 case studies. And the authors, one of the findings of the authors was that most families use self-recovery. As Dave mentioned, there's usually 5% of the total recovery costs come from public money. And sort of what they said is that the lesson here is that most institutional assistance approaches have completely, across all those 100 cases, have completely ignored the fact that families use a mix of recovery approaches, including self-recovery, mutual assistance, sort of like compound, but the different compounds helping each other, or the families within a compound helping each other, or remittance money. And institutional approaches have ignored that families have access and have these other recovery approaches that they utilize. And so, this is in the 70s, and it's like 50 years later, and we still see the same approach, especially like, you speak about, donors wanting to bring in steel and other things that completely ignores the fact that families have this capability to self-recover.
Yeah.
And so what I think would be really interesting, because I don't think it really does exist, is sort of like a methodology or means of evaluating and assessing families, affected families, access and capability for self-recovery and also for mutual recovery.
Yeah.
And then build in an assistance or an institutional public assistance approach that really facilitates those two approaches.
Yeah.
And it would be neat to like kind of develop sort of like a methodology whereby, across different contexts, even more sort of urban contexts, where we can better analyze, self-recovery capability of families and mutual assistance capability. I also saw a report by the World Bank that said that, public assistance completely ignored in the aftermath of the Haiti community. They completely oversaw and missed the ability of those families to self-recover. And so I find this is really neat, because it's really is based on best practice, and sort of 50 years later, like taking actually this lesson learned very seriously, because it's been around and it's been ignored.
Well, I mean, before we show up, it was not like that. Okay. So we actually the direct influence the whole class to go in this best practice position there. But what Sabine said is actually really important. The public money available to say fix things usually affect about plus minus 10% of total damage. 90% people have to reconstruct. There's just no option. That's how it's happened. So method developing is 10% of doing it. Be able to implement by the local people. That's very critical, right? Otherwise, nothing can get done, or people build back actually in a much more same as dangerous as it was before. So that's why the speed to address this 10% is really critical, so people can see that. In Haiti, earthquake that we think addressed almost like a 12 to 14,000 so-called yellow tag damaged houses to repair by the Haitian Masons, and that's only about a tenth of a total repairs happened. 100,000 of them repaired by locally, people just repair back. The particular case, they copy our methodologies, many cases. So that's the kind of become the kind of habit of practice actually. So yeah, that's very important. That's why that we can address only 10th of what happened to it, but communicate to this best practice throughout population. That's a really key part of a so-called wholesome recovery here. And as Dr. Shagza said, his house in Tashkent went through a 1966 earthquake in magnitude 8. It was a mud bricks house, just fine. It must have a pretty good waterproofing, Shagza, I imagine. And a thick wall, 50 centimeter, I bet. Yeah, exactly. All right, at the top of hour now, are there any comments or questions? Well, if it's not, thanks so much. And team is going to go back to the Afghanistan next week. And we're going to get into basically next phase of the so-called actual doing the work. So that will be happening there, including myself, will be there. And one of the things we're doing actually building a local team, which is actually really critical. So our job is to not just do ourselves, actually, to really get so-called knowledge sharing, go back and forth with a local team. A local team would be essentially the implementation arm of it. So that's our next steps here. So, and yeah, further questions, either email all of us, either of us, and just let me know. So meantime, and if you know about like details of like what we saw culturally and stuff like that, there's a couple of my journals in Connect site. So you can also see that too, so you can see it, what we saw, what we ate and stuff like that. I think it's kind of neat. And so we'll be back. So talk to you pretty soon. Thanks so much.
Thank
Good
you.
stuff.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody. Bye. Bye.